I'm only writing this down because the police told me there isn't much else they can do, and I need someone, somewhere, to know what actually happened that night. I haven't told my parents or my friends the full details because I don't want them looking at me with that specific kind of pity, but I can't keep it locked in my head anymore. This is the only way I can think of to create a permanent record of the events before I lose my mind wondering if I'm just being paranoid. It was a Tuesday in mid-November, or maybe it was a Wednesday, but I remember it was one of those nights where the fog just sits heavy on the asphalt. I worked the late shift at a diner called the Rusty Spoon, which is basically just a glorified shipping container sitting on a desolate stretch of Highway 41. Usually, there's a bit of a rush around 9:00 p.m. from the truckers passing through, but by 11:00 p.m., the place is usually a graveyard. That night was particularly dead, even for a weekday, and the overhead fluorescent lights were doing that annoying humming thing that makes you feel like your brain is vibrating. I was behind the counter, scrubbing at a grease stain that had probably been there since the 70s, just trying to kill the last hour before I could lock up. The diner has these massive plate glass windows that face the parking lot, and because it's so dark out there, the glass basically turns into a mirror at night. I could see myself reflected in the window, looking tired, hair a mess, wearing that stained polyester apron. But then I noticed something else in the reflection. A pair of headlights was cutting through the fog at the very edge of the lot, about 50 yards away from the building. The car didn't pull into a parking spot or come toward the entrance. It just sat there, idling at an angle that pointed the high beams directly into the dining room. I remember squinting against the glare and feeling a bit annoyed at first, thinking it was just some teenager messing around or someone lost and checking their GPS. But 5 minutes went by, and then 10, and the car didn't move an inch. It was just this white, blinding wall of light staring me down while I stood there with a damp rag in my hand. I tried to ignore it and went back to restocking the sugar caddies, but I kept glancing up at the clock, then back at the lights. There was something about the stillness of the vehicle that started to get under my skin, like it was a predator just waiting for me to acknowledge it. I even walked over to the window and shielded my eyes with my hand, trying to see the make or model of the car, but the brightness was too intense to make out anything but a dark silhouette. I remember thinking that if they didn't move in another 5 minutes, I was going to call the non-emergency line just to be safe. Just as I reached for the phone behind the counter, the high beams finally flickered off, plunging the lot back into that dull, misty gray. I watched as the driver's side door opened slowly and a man stepped out, though I couldn't see his face because he kept his head down against the wind. He was wearing a dark, heavy coat that looked a bit too big for his frame, and he walked with this very deliberate, slow pace toward the front door. My heart was thumping a little faster than it should have been, but I told myself I was being dramatic because this was a public business and he was just a customer. The bell above the door gave that lonely metallic jingle as he stepped inside, and the first thing I noticed was the smell. Not cigarettes or cologne, but something like damp earth and old paper. He didn't look at me, not even when I gave him the standard greeting and told him he could sit anywhere he liked. He walked straight to the corner booth, the one furthest from the counter, and tucked behind a large plastic fern that we never bothered to dust. I grabbed a menu and a glass of water, feeling the weight of the silence in the room as I approached his table. When I set the menu down, he didn't reach for it. He just kept his hands folded on the laminate tabletop, staring at the empty space between them. I asked him what I could get for him, and his voice was so low I almost missed it. Just a single word, coffee. I nodded, trying to be professional, and asked if he wanted cream or sugar, but he didn't answer me, so I just backed away and headed for the pots. My hands were shaking a little bit while I poured the liquid into a ceramic mug, and I remember thinking how strange it was that he hadn't even looked at the menu. I brought the coffee back to him and set it down, along with a small stack of paper napkins, and he finally muttered a thanks without lifting his gaze. I retreated back to the safety of the counter, picking up my phone to text my roommate that I might be a few minutes late, but I found that I had no service. That wasn't entirely unusual for that stretch of the highway, but it added a fresh layer of isolation to the atmosphere that I really didn't appreciate. I stood there for what felt like forever, watching him out of the corner of my eye while pretending to organize the ticket spikes. The man did not drink the coffee. He did not pick up the mug. Instead, he took one of the paper napkins and began to tear it. He ripped a small square and placed it on the table, then ripped another one of the same size. He repeated this action many times, his fingers moving in a steady, unnatural pattern that was disturbing to observe from a distance. I couldn't take my eyes off him, even though I knew I should probably be doing something else to look busy. He was so focused on those napkins, ignoring the steaming coffee, ignoring the humming lights, and ignoring me entirely. Each time he finished a square, he would line it up perfectly with the one before it, creating a growing grid of white paper on the dark table. I felt this cold knot forming in my stomach because normal people don't go into a diner at midnight to perform a ritual with napkins without ever taking a sip of their drink. 40 minutes passed like this, and the grid of paper squares had grown to cover nearly half the table's surface. Every so often, he would stop, tilt his head as if listening to something I couldn't hear, and then go right back to the tearing. I realized then that I hadn't seen him blink once the entire time I had been observing him from the counter. I decided I'd had enough of the weirdness and decided to go into the back office to call the owner, hoping he'd tell me it was okay to just kick the guy out and close early. I went through the swinging door into the kitchen and the small office feeling relieved to have a barrier. The kitchen was dark with red lights, and the silence was noticeable compared to the dining room noise. I quickly entered the office and reached for the phone on the desk, my fingers a bit clumsy with the receiver wanting to hear a familiar voice. When I put the phone to my ear, there was no sound, just a silence that made me uneasy. I pulled the phone closer and saw the cord had been cut with the wires inside showing. A cold sweat broke out across my forehead as I realized the line hadn't just malfunctioned. Someone had purposefully cut it to keep me from calling out. My mind immediately went to the back door, and I ran over to check the heavy steel bolt, praying that I had remembered to lock it after the trash run earlier that evening. It was locked, but as I stood there catching my breath, I noticed something white tucked into the frame of the office door. It was a small, glossy Polaroid photo, face down, and my hand trembled so violently I almost couldn't pick it up. When I finally turned it over, the air left my lungs in a sharp, painful gasp that left me feeling lightheaded and sick. The picture displayed my vehicle in the driveway of the residence I occupied. It featured some decals on the back and a light that needed repair. The image was captured after dark from the area behind my lot, as a light source caused a reflection on the rear plate. I checked the security system screen, but it showed only interference. The view from the cameras inside was unavailable. I stood by the desk trying to calm myself and think through the worry that was building up. I knew I could not stay in the office indefinitely, as the person outside was aware of my presence and had likely been observing for some time. The thought that they had been near my home while I was inside made me uneasy. I felt like I was in a difficult situation, and the person who had caused it was nearby working on something. I needed a tool or something similar, so I began looking through the desk drawers. I picked up a small item from the counter and put it in my apron pocket. My hands felt stiff from holding it, and I noticed I was biting my lip. I knew I had to go back to check if he was still at the table or had moved closer to the kitchen. The thought of him moving around the dining area while I was in a private space felt more concerning than returning to my tasks. I reviewed the information one last time, put it in my pocket, and prepared to go back to the dining area. The change from the dim office to the bright diner lights was sudden, and I felt visible as I entered. I kept my hand on the object in my pocket, my gaze searching for the person who had been at the table. The table was empty, the drink still there, but the person was gone. I looked around the room, by the counter and near the restrooms, but the door was shut, and I heard no sound. I entered the room and went to the table to look at what was there. As I got closer, I saw the papers he had been working on. I had a strong feeling. He had arranged the many small white papers into a series of numbers and lines. I stood over the table and read the sequence of digits he had carefully laid out on the table. I found my social security number with a small paper arrow pointing toward the kitchen where I had been. My knees felt weak, and I had to grab the edge of the table to keep from falling. The level of detail needed to get that information meant this wasn't just someone following me, but someone who had access to my private records or had been watching my identity for a long time. I felt like the walls were closing in, the bright yellow walls of the diner suddenly feeling like a confined space. I realized then that the man hadn't been waiting for his coffee at all. He had been waiting for me to realize how much power he had over my life. The fact that he knew my personal information and my home address meant this wasn't a random encounter at a roadside diner. I felt a sudden, frantic urge to check the front door, and I ran over to the entrance, twisting the lock and leaning my forehead against the cool glass. The parking lot was empty now, the sedan with the high beams gone, as if it had never been there in the first place, leaving only the swirling fog behind. I stood there for a long time, watching the mist roll across the highway, wondering if he was still out there in the dark watching me through the windows from a distance. Every shadow in the kitchen now looked like a crouching figure, and every creak of the building sounded like a footstep on the floorboards. I eventually found the courage to go back to the office and grab my car keys, knowing I couldn't stay in the diner until morning. I didn't bother turning off the lights or setting the alarm. I just ran for my car, my heart leaping into my throat every time a branch scraped against the side of the building. I had difficulty opening the car door and then got inside. I then secured the doors and departed quickly, checking my mirrors, concerned about another vehicle. The journey home felt lengthy, with each passing car creating unease. I held a tool in my hand while driving, my hand steady. When I finally pulled into my driveway, I didn't get out of the car right away. I just sat there with the engine running, scanning the tree line where the Polaroid had likely been taken. The house looked exactly as I had left it, dark and quiet, but the sight of it didn't bring me the comfort it usually did. I eventually made a dash for the front porch, my keys already out and ready, and I practically fell through the door as I slammed it shut and through every lock I owned. I went through the entire house, turning on every single light until the place was glowing, checking behind shower curtains and inside the laundry room. I felt like a child afraid of the dark, but the reality of the paper squares on that diner table was too heavy to ignore. I finally made it to my bedroom, intending to grab my laptop to try and find a way to contact the police through an online portal since my phone was still useless. As I walked toward my bed, I noticed that the window was cracked open just a fraction of an inch, allowing a sliver of cold November air to whistle into the room. I knew for a fact I had closed and locked that window before leaving for my shift because the weather had been turning so quickly. My heart stopped as I looked down at my pillow, which was illuminated by the harsh light of my bedside lamp. Resting right in the center of the pillowcase was a single, tiny square of white paper, torn with the exact same jagged precision as the ones at the diner. I was preoccupied that evening, and the next, reviewing site access logs and security camera footage in the office. I sat in the conference room with a notebook on my lap, watching the main entrance until sunrise. The authorities arrived the next morning and filed a report, but said that without specific details, there was little they could do except enhance surveillance. They confirmed that the communication lines at the cafe had been disconnected using heavy tools, and they noted the discarded paper goods, though they treated it more as a minor incident than a serious matter. They could not determine how someone had entered the building without evidence of tampering, suggesting that I might have overlooked securing the entry point myself. The most unsettling part of the police visit was when they checked the perimeter of my house and found a small pile of cigarette butts just outside my bedroom window. They were all fresh, and they were arranged in a small, perfect circle, mimicking the way the man had laid out the napkins at the diner. I realized then that while I was at work, he had been standing right outside my wall, listening to the silence of my empty house. He had been inside, he had been outside, and he had been everywhere I thought I was safe. I felt like I was being dismantled piece by piece by someone who enjoyed the process of watching me unravel. I ended up quitting that job the very next day and moving back in with my parents in a different state within the week, leaving most of my furniture behind. I changed my social security number, which is a bureaucratic nightmare I wouldn't wish on anyone, but I still feel like I'm being tracked by someone who knows my every move. Every time I see a silver sedan or someone tearing a piece of paper in a public place, I feel that same cold knot of dread tightening in my stomach. I've spent the last few months looking over my shoulder, waiting for the other shoe to drop or for another photograph to appear in my mail. I am in a library surrounded by people, but feel watched from nearby. I notice small things like doors ajar or objects moved. I know he is still around, and the fact that he never did anything wrong feels like he is playing a long game. I wanted to share this in case something happens to me, so there is a record of where it began. The worst part is that I found another napkin square this morning, tucked inside the battery compartment of my new television remote. I haven't even had the diner job for 6 months, and I'm hundreds of miles away, but he's still here, hiding in the details of my life. I don't know how he finds me, and I don't know what he wants, but I know that I'll never truly be alone again. Every time I close my eyes, I just see those high beams cutting through the fog, waiting for me to step out into the light. I'm going to stop here because my hands are shaking so hard I can barely hit the keys, and honestly, the silence in this room is starting to feel a lot heavier than it did 10 minutes ago. I need to go double check the locks on my car and maybe just sit in the light for a while until my heart rate slows down. I really hope that by putting this out there, I can finally breathe a little easier, and I seriously hope none of you ever have to know what it feels like to realize you've become someone's long-term project. Just stay sharp and trust your gut. If something feels off, it probably is.